On this episode of Hall of Heroes History, we're going to talk about the beginnings of DC Comics. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Hall of Heroes History podcast. We appreciate you guys joining us. This is episode 3. This time we're going to be talking about the beginnings, the origins of how DC got started. It's very interesting. There's a lot more involved than there was for Marvel because they are the ones DC actually kicks everything off.
Right.
So we'll figure out how all that started, and we'll start with Alan giving us a little intro into how this all began and why we're here today.
Well, first, I want to everybody excuse me. I am the allergy boy today, is my superhero name.
Yeah.
It's pollen season, so everything's blooming, and so I'm all like this. So I'll be off my game a little bit today, but hey, we're gonna power through this. But so DC Comics, it was founded in 1935, and it was called National Comics in New York. And the founder was Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. And, of course, he made everyone call him the Major because he had a bit of a swelled head, you know.
Yeah. He was a very eccentric kind of guy.
Yes.
He was very proud of himself. He was one of the youngest. They claim, or he claimed, that he was one of the youngest majors ever in the cavalry at 27 years old.
At World War I.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was pretty cool. But a funny story before we get into the DC stuff and everything is that he actually wrote a letter to President Warren G. Harding while he was in the military, and said that he was complaining about the higher up officers, guys that were ahead of him. Yeah. And he complained. I don't know what the complaint was, but it must have been something.
Okay.
Because he got shot not too long after that.
Friendly fire.
Yeah. Well, not so friendly, because I think it was because he was complaining about the higher ups.
Probably.
And his family, they called it, what did they call it? They called it an Army sanctioned assassination attempt.
Ooh.
And the Army called it an accident because they thought this guy that shot him thought that he was another officer trying to break into another officer's house, when that was not the case at all.
Okay.
So he had to deal with that, and then he kind of complained a little bit here and there about other stuff, and we'll find out a little bit about that in a little bit. There's another small major story that is absolutely insane.
Yeah, you kind of deep dive into his history. He didn't play well with others.
No, he did not.
Exactly, yeah. So as far as comics, DC, National Comics at this time, their first comic was New Fun Comics. Came out in February of 1935. We do not have a copy of that in our archives, unfortunately. We'd love to have one. Then they started a second title called New Comics. New Comics didn't do very well. It only lasted a few issues and kind of flopped. The Major was one of the first to not pay artists and creators, which pretty much became a thing throughout the 40s and 50s, that artists were getting screwed over and to pay for a higher scale, and they didn't keep the copyrights. And of course, Siegel and Schuster, that we'll talk about, are the most famous ones that got ripped off, for Superman, of course.
Right.
And then, so then he brought partners on, Donifield and Lebowitz, who were the printers.
Yeah.
They became partners, and then they started Detective Comics in 1937. And that's when they changed the name to DC.
Yeah.
Was in honor of Detective Comics. And, of course, everybody knows that Batman started Detective Comics, but he was not in issue 1. He was not until issue 27. 2 years later in 1939. Interesting thing, though, is they did, for Action Comics, they did an ash can. And Superman was not on the ash can of that. And there's only 3 of those that exist. And we do not have one of them. It was just really cool. And Siegel and Schuster began working at DC Comics in 1935. And, of course, Superman didn't come out until 38.
Right.
And
they are credited with Dr. Occult.
That's correct. Yep. Dr. Occult. They did a character called Henry Duval, who was like a detective.
Right.
In fact, they were all detective stories. You had the early detectives had, them, Dr. Occult, Slam Bradley, that later becomes a love interest of Selina Kyle Catwoman.
Right.
let's say Crimson Avenger appeared in Detective Comics before Batman, when he had like the hood and the red mask and the cape.
Kind of the first costumed or like vigilante type.
It's kind of between him and the Phantom. Because the Phantom appeared in 36, 2 years before.
In the comic strip.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those two are kind of some of the early ones that started on. But yeah, Siegel and Schuster did a lot, and they didn't want Superman in the comic books because comic books were, of course, another name is funny books. It's for kids.
Yeah.
The real money at that time in the 30s was if you could get a newspaper strip. So they wanted Superman for newspapers in the comic strips because that's, you get syndicated.
Right.
You make big money. I mean, look at the guys that do Garfield and Dagwood and, all of these characters in the newspaper strips. They get big money.
Well, now that was one of Wheeler Nicholson's ideas is that his original comic book stories.
Right.
Because comic books before that was just a whole bunch of reprints of the Sunday Funnies. Exactly. That's all it was. And so they were just reselling those.
Right. Repackaging
and then
them,
Malcolm came in, the Major, he came in and said, what if we just created our own stories?
Right.
And everybody thought he was crazy. They're like, that's not going to go. No one knows who these characters are.
They thought he was crazy anyway, though.
That's true. He was crazy. Yeah. And that's how he got pushed out of that whole by Harry Donenfeld.
Right, exactly.
He was told to go on vacation.
Right.
Did you hear that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The Major was told to go on vacation, and then when he got back, his doors were locked.
They changed the locks and locked him out of the building and everything. Yeah. They did. Yeah. They just he, like I said, he didn't play well with others.
No.
There's just a long history of that from him. But yeah, so Siegel and Schuster, they were going around for years trying to sell Superman to the newspaper strips, and they just couldn't. Nobody would pick it up, and they finally relented because Action Comics #1 was coming out, and DC wanted a character for the launch of Action Comics, and the Major convinced Siegel and Schuster to let him do Superman on Action Comics #1. So that's kind of how Superman came into, but their intention for years was to have it as a comic strip in the newspapers.
Right.
And it was never supposed to be in the comic books. That's not what they wanted, but they finally, they got worn down after just, dozens of rejections.
Well, they had rejections, and I also read that some of that wasn't rejections. Like they always said that they were rejected. Superman was rejected. Right. He was always rejected. When in all actuality, if you read some of the deep dive stuff, some of it was just timing. Like they were supposed to be on the tag end of another comic that they're putting out.
Right.
And that comic only got one issue because it didn't go anywhere.
Right.
And so when the second issue was supposed to come out, it didn't come out because the first one didn't do well. So the timing of it didn't work.
Right.
So there was some Superman stuff where they actually had an opportunity, but just the timing didn't work out. So they weren't rejected by everyone.
Right.
Sometimes it just didn't work.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, so Superman makes his debut in Action Comics #1, June 1938. And then Superman gets in the newspapers a year later in 39.
Which is what they wanted.
Right, exactly. But it's flip-flop, so the comics got the character popular, then boom, then he kind of segued into that. So then, so there's a second company that's part of DC.
Right.
It's called All American Comics. Okay, and it was founded by Max Gaines, and that's a name that a lot of people will be familiar with. And Leibowitz was the guy. I can't remember. I didn't have written down his first name. Jack Leibowitz. Yeah, and they in 1939 became a sister company into DC because they were both in the same building.
Right.
Yeah, so it was weird. They were separate companies, but they were like in the same office.
Yeah.
Kind of sharing office space.
Yeah.
And that was pretty common back then that companies would do that.
Right.
So they're sharing office space, and then they just start doing some collaboration. And so then they come out with All American #1 and Movie Comics #1. So they're kind of doing comics on some of the movies
that were big at the time.
Exactly. And so then DC is like, hey, we've got, National is saying, hey, we got this huge hit with Superman and we need another big hit. So they go to Bob Kane, who we know is, the co-creator, along with Bill Finger,
right,
of Batman. We got to make sure Bill Finger gets his due credit.
Right. And Bob Kane, who was originally Bob Kahn.
Yes.
Khan.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then he became Bob Kane.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they create Batman for Detective Comics 27, which comes out in May of 39. So just almost a year later after Superman, which was June of 38.
Right.
So yeah, they come out with, so Batman, Bob Kane was interesting. He actually retained the rights to Batman, where Siegel and Schuster sold the rights to Superman for I think it was like $130 at the time, which was probably a fortune in the 30s.
Yeah, still.
It was nothing compared to what the revenue
could have been
that they made on Superman.
Right.
And so then you've got, their second big hit is Batman, of course. And Bob Kane, he was smart enough that he retained the copyrights to the character, and then he hired all these ghostwriters and artists to do stuff for him, and he screwed them over.
Yeah,
like the company screwed everybody over. Bob Kane was almost like a company himself, that was doing this, because Bill Finger created Joker and Catwoman, a lot of these early characters.
Yeah,
and of course Bob Kane just took full credit
for everything.
Absolutely, yeah, he was a credit hog, and then of course we have and we have some examples here of some early Superman. So we have a Superman right here, Superman number 3, which is from 39. This is our earliest Superman comic book in the museum's collection. And Superman just becomes huge with merchandising. They get their own radio show. In fact, Kryptonite was never in the comics. Kryptonite was first mentioned on the Superman radio program.
Right.
And which was interesting. And so they come out with all these toys and merchandise. We have the Superman Dime Bank, the Superman tank right here, the Superman plane. It's like a wind up and he lifts the plane up. This is a new piece we got, which is extremely rare. This is the Superman wooden Sirocco statue. And these came out in 1942. They were never available for sale to the public.
They were distributed to
exactly just like the top 100 distributors. And so, interesting story. We just picked this up last year at the Great Ohio Toy Show. So if you're a toy collector, you want to go to the Mid Ohio Toy Show. It's amazing. And so this piece I got from a gentleman. So they did 100 of these wooden Supermans in 42. You normally, if you come across one, it's all wood and only the emblem and the cape is red. But apparently 10 of the 100 were done in full color. This is one of the 10, the rare ones. And I've only been able to track down that 3 of these exist today. And so we just got this last year, and it's the rare one. And so, funny story, if you know your geography, if you're local to us, I saw this guy in Ohio 4.5 hours from here, and I asked him where he got it. He goes, well, I got it in this little town called Niles, Michigan. And I'm like, I know where Niles, Michigan is. It's 10 minutes from our museum.
Yeah.
And so he bought it out. It was an old 5 and dime store that he bought out in the 1970s. And this was sitting in a desk drawer in the back. It had been sitting there since 1942 probably.
Wow.
Because they never really thought to sell it because it wasn't for sale. It was like a thank you gift from DC. National DC at the time. So they probably just threw it in the desk drawer and it sat there for 30 years.
Yeah.
This guy gets it, sits on it for another 40 or 50 years, and then now it's here at our museum. So, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's it looks great. It looks brand new. It's gorgeous. But yeah, just a neat little history about that piece that I thought was really cool. And then we have, of course, Batman. Let's kind of put put Batman right here. Let's put Batman right there. So we've got early Batmans. This is our earliest Batman, Detective 38. We don't have a Detective 27 here at the museum's collection. But what's interesting about the 38 is it is the debut of Robin, who is the first teenage sidekick.
Yeah,
which is really cool. And it was, because kids were reading comic books. So they bring Robin on to have a character relatable to them.
Right.
That's
because
a teen.
Detective Comics, I mean, that was like mysteries, detectives, stuff like that. That's what was big at the time.
Right.
And so kids probably thought, well, maybe Batman's not for me. Maybe that's for my parents or something like that.
Right.
So to bring those kids in, they were like, well, we're going to give him a sidekick. So that way the kids know that this is for the kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then Timely does it shortly, probably. So this came out in 40. So a year later, when they introduced Captain America, of course, he has Bucky immediately.
Right.
So they're kind of copying the same thing that they saw. Oh, all these kids love Robin. They think Robin's great. So Timely does the same thing with Captain America with Bucky, and then Human Torch and Toro.
Yeah.
So they kind of, and then of course in the 50s, and you got Namor and Namorita, his younger teen cousin.
Yeah.
So they're just trying to come up with these characters to make it relatable to the teens that are the readers, but Robin was the first one.
They started realizing that they had a demographic.
Exactly.
And they started to, go towards
absolutely,
it.
Absolutely. Batman 1 introduces Joker and Catwoman, but they didn't call her Catwoman.
They called her
in
Cat.
issue 1. Yeah, they called her the Cat in issue 1, and then they used the name Catwoman in Batman 2, which we do have a Batman 2, which is second Joker, second Catwoman. We just got that. Actually, that's a recent edition. We just picked up the number a couple weeks ago. Yeah, exactly. So now DC. So like with Timely, what we talked about, they had their three. They had Captain America, they had Human Torch, they had Submariner. Those were kind of their three big ones. And they had a couple smaller characters. But DC and All American are in the same offices, and they're just cranking out characters. I mean, they cranked out more characters than any other company in the 40s. They start. So then, Jerry Siegel actually helped create the Spectre.
Yeah.
So he kind of helped with that. And then there's Dr. Fate and Hourman, and then All American in issue 16. It introduces Green Lantern by Marty Nodell in 1940, and then Flash by Gardner Fox in January of 1940. So they're the next two that come rolling out.
That's the Jay Garrett. That's the Alan Scott.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Yep, right. And so we've got All-Star Comics, right here. So they could bring out All-Star, and they have the individual stories on those characters. But then issue 3, they form the first superhero team, the JSA, the Justice Society.
Yeah.
That comes out in All-Star Comics number 3 in December of 1940.
It's very cool.
It's very cool.
Because one of my favorite things in comics when I first started was that I like groups. I like when people are together, trying to figure out a whole thing, because I just want as many characters in there as possible.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? That's what's the fun of it's the fun of it for me sometimes. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
I like that.
Now, All-Star Comics number 8, which we do not have, introduces the first big female character. And
it's one of my favorites, my absolute.
Yeah, and so we don't have an All-Star 8, but what we do have is the Sensation 1, which is the first cover and first full appearance, because in All-Star 8, it was only an 8-page introduction to Wonder Woman. And so then that led into this book, the Sensation Comics, which for decades, everyone said Sensation 1 is Wonder Woman's first appearance. DC said that for years.
Right.
It's only been in the last decade that they've kind of really focused and said, no, All-Star 8 was, because they had like the teaser in there for 8 pages. But this is like the full Wonder Woman's first full comic cover that's, about her.
Right.
But it also introduces the first appearance of Wildcat from the JSA.
Okay.
And they've got, in here you've got the first appearance of Wonder Woman, Wildcat, Mr. Terrific, and the Gay Ghost.
Oh,
which meant something very different back then.
Yeah.
So it was known as the Happy Ghost.
The Happy Ghost.
Yeah.
Well, and then it also Wonder Woman hits a stride, a really, really cool spot. Yeah. Because that's when the men are leaving to go to war.
Right.
And the women are staying home and doing all the men, the men's work.
Right. Exactly.
And so they needed a person to kind of represent. And it kind of just worked out. And that's why she kind of took off. Because, the Rosie the Riveter type of thing. And
that's what it was. I mean, Rosie the Riveter actually was very influential on the creation of Wonder Woman. But American GIs, their most popular characters in comics were Captain America and Wonder Woman, because they both dressed as a flag.
Right.
But of course, Wonder Woman made a very nice pinup girl.
Right.
And so if you see like a lot of the World War II bombers, they would have pinup girls. The pilots would.
Right.
And there was a plane that had Wonder Woman painted on it. There was one that had Superman painted on it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we actually have one of the original photos of one of the Superman ones. Oh. I've not been able to find a picture of the Wonder one. I've looked for years and haven't been able to find one.
Oh, that'd be cool to have.
So, if anybody can help us out with that, that would be awesome.
Also, Wonder Woman was created by Professor William Martin, who was also the inventor of the lie detector test. Yep. So that might explain why Wonder Woman has the lasso of truth.
Yep.
And he was also you can deep dive on Professor William Marston.
He's an interesting character.
Yeah. He was doing things back in the 30s that we have shows for today. I'll just say that.
Right. Well, now, do you know how Marston got roped in to DC Comics?
You asked me, so I get to answer.
I'll let you answer.
So maybe, if I'm correct, is that he was a critic of the comics.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
And if you do your deep dive on Professor William Marston, it's a little weird that he was trying to say that comics weren't family friendly.
Right.
They weren't very family friendly. And so then they were like, well, then you write one.
The guy that had a three-way marriage going on.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
right, exactly, yeah. Pot calling kettle black there.
Yeah. And so he's critiquing comics, and then they I can't remember who came to him and said, somebody from All American Comics or something like that.
They did, yeah. They came to him, and because he was there were several anti-comic articles that he wrote in Family Circle.
Right.
And so then, they approached him and said, hey, tell us what we can do to clean up our act. And they asked him to create a female character for the company. And of course, he created Wonder Woman. And so it's kind of like, you get more with honey than, and so they just, instead of him being an enemy, they brought him on board, which was actually very smart.
It's very smart.
Yeah, very smart.
Keep your enemies closer.
Yeah, unfortunately, it didn't work with Dr. Frederick Wertham a decade later, but it certainly did work with Marston, and they brought him in, and it was actually Max Gaines.
Who
approached him? Yeah, Max Gaines approached him from All American and asked him to create a female heroine for them.
Yeah.
And so now we're about the time Wonder Woman comes out is also the same. It was the same month as Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
They both happened in December of 1941. So then at this point, all comic book covers become propaganda. And so the Superman cover that we have over here, that shows, and this is a very famous Superman cover, and it shows, Superman cranking out just an old newspaper printing press, and it says on there, Superman says you can slap a Jap. Very racist. That would never be published today. But at this time in history, not only is it accepted, it's encouraged.
Right.
At this time. And it's known as the racist Superman comic book because Superman is the most wholesome and pure of superheroes. For him to be having racist behavior, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's shocking. Ours is a 7.5, no restoration. It's actually our museum's copy is the third best known copy of this comic that exists. That is actually the rare Superman comic book.
Right.
Not the most expensive. It's not as much as an Action one. But I can tell you this, it took me over a decade to find one of these for the museum's collection. And in that time, I came across a half a dozen Action ones for sale.
Wow.
Couldn't afford them.
Right.
But they were for sale. They were available. Yes, they were available. But the Action 58, the Slap-a-Jap, is really tough to find. And it is the most difficult Superman comic book to find.
Right.
Yeah, it's very, very tough. Interesting thing, though, is because Superman was kind of the icon of the company.
Right.
And so you got like radio, you've got he was the first animated cartoon, the Fleischer cartoons from 1940-41.
They're very cool.
They're great. I mean, it was same quality as like Disney, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and stuff like that. I mean, it was Disney quality.
Right.
And it still holds up today. But what's interesting is Superman was not the first DC property to get a film, a black and white serial. It was actually Batman. Yeah, Batman got Columbia Pictures did a 15-part serial starring Lewis Wilson as Batman and Douglas Croft as Robin. And then DC would have 7 different serials of their characters.
Wow.
And so it was Hop Harrigan, which was from All American. They did 2 different Superman serials, 2 different Batmans. They even did a Congo Bill and a Vigilante.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Western character.
Yeah.
And they were all through Columbia Pictures.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. It was really interesting. The Batman one It's cool. We have this really neat piece here because they didn't do any Batman merchandise until the 60s. So this is like the only Batman piece from the 40s. This is the movie poster. And what was funny is Columbia was doing Batman and also the Phantom. So this got goofed up. You see where it says, it shows Batman, it says the Phantom.
Yep.
And it's red. So it was completely wrong. So this was an error.
Right.
And they goofed it up. Somebody made a mistake. But what's really cool is the theaters, they had these masks, a red one and a black one. And so these are really cool. So I was able to track these down and get one of the original movie posters and the actual masks that were given away at the theaters, you know, when this movie came out in 43. Yeah.
As promotional. So like we get stuff like that. We think about it, you know, we don't even think about it now that we get promotional stuff when we go to the theater, like the fun buckets or you know, different things like that. This might be the first time that you ever have something like that.
It could be, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really great though.
So that wraps up a little bit of what we're talking about. We're going to do a quick break. We'll show you a commercial and then we'll be back right after this.